Hello, everyone. We are back for another archetype discussion. I am joined here by my excellent friend, Dr. A.P. Canavan. How are you today, A.P.?
Back once again, like the literary masters.
That's right.
It, it's great to be here, Philip. Great to be back.
It's fantastic to have you. As always, I really enjoy our discussions, whether they be Malazan or archetype or what have you. We have a good time. And I hope that will be the case. Today, we are talking about the tripartite maiden mother crone. This is the first video we're going to have on this subject. And we are going to focus on one aspect of the maiden mother crone. A little bit later, the wicked witch. So that is going to be, I think, a big one. I mean, this is one that definitely comes up a lot in fantasy, and it goes way back into mythology, and but we see it crop up all over the place, and a lot of different incarnations of the maiden and the mother and the crone, with all kinds of psychological ramifications. Right? This is, I think, a pretty big archetype we're getting into here.
Yeah, and if you recall, when we started and we were looking at the Jungian archetypes, there was this assumption that we were only looking at male archetypes. And a lot of the Jungian stuff applied equally male-female. But when you start looking at the application of specifically female, the biggest sort of archetype and symbol and metaphor for it is in the maiden, mother, and crone. So if you think the cycle of life, being born, youth, then giving birth and the maturity of life, and then death, the end of life. That's the maiden, mother, and crone encompass all aspects of it. So that's one major aspect of this, and it is tied into this particular archetype. And interestingly enough, if anyone is watching the adaptation of the Arthur C. Clarke series, oh no, Isaac Asimov. Foundation.
It's Asimov. Yes, yes.
Sorry,
Asimov.
I'm getting old, Philip. It's hard to remember these. Asimov.
Yeah.
Asimov's Foundation.
Yeah.
The Empire, the Emperor, is the male version of Maiden, Mother, and Crone. Okay. And it's a really interesting inversion of what is typically and is almost always a female archetype. So it's just, people can look at that because that's how they have made Empire, that it is the young man as the child, the mature man as the sort of can go and have liaisons with people, and then the grandfatherly sort of character, the three stages of life. But Maiden, Mother, and Crone is what we're here to talk about, not the male variant that was on.
And it's so interesting how each of these three stages has both positive and negative incarnations. And I think one interesting approach that I've come across in terms of explaining this would be the Freudian approach, which is, we can talk about sort of these in general terms first for a bit, but the Freudian approach, which was probably best explained by Otto Rank, which I've mentioned before in some of our previous discussions, his book, The Myth of the Birth of the Hero. But Joseph Campbell talks about this as well, the beneficent goddess on the one hand, and then the terrible, terrifying, force of evil that has a female manifestation on the other hand. I mean, they come in various forms and various stories. And the Freudian explanation behind this is I find it's curious, I think, in some respects. And of course, back when Freud was writing, they focused on the male perspective. So that's kind of where this is coming from. But looking at the mother as one's first attachment, right? You're in that beautiful, blissful stage of just baby and mommy, and baby looks at this figure who's nourishing it, and as this beneficent goddess-like figure that you're in this state of blissful attachment to. And then comes along daddy, and daddy Daddy interferes with this. Daddy gets in the way. Daddy is the bad force that breaks up this wonderful relationship between baby and mommy, right?
I am not calling you daddy.
That's probably for the best. That's probably for the best. But anyway, so then what happens is a baby has to grow up and be independent of mommy, and mommy becomes the terrible, nasty, evil goddess or whatever, because there's a rejection of baby. There's a rejection of this initial blissful phase. So here you see right away the two aspects of the mother figure. You have the kind goddess, and you have the evil witch who rejects the baby, and they are two faces of the same thing. And according to this sort of view of everything, so obviously very male perspective in explaining all of this, but I find it kind of interesting.
To paraphrase Tom Lehrer's song about this, you say one thing about Oedipus: he loved his mother.
Yes, exactly.
And you can see the psychology of it, and this is why this archetype ties in so well with a lot of representations of female deities, both in mythology as well as in fantasy.
Exactly.
That we have these different aspects of the benevolent, loving mother figure, and then the terrible, evil crone. Is typically how it's represented. We even talk about Mother Earth, but you've been reading the Dresden Files, and we can see this in aspects of the queens of fairy and how they are organized. Titania and Maeve and the various aspects of that,
and even Leia, I would say the foster mother. Right.
But one of the great representations of it in fantasy literature that is a lot of fun, before we talk about a whole of the deity stuff, is in Terry Pratchett's Discworld, because you have Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Og, and Magrat, and Pratchett even makes that comparison to this Maiden, Mother, and Crone explicit in one of the books, and I've forgotten which one, but he actually makes it explicit. And Magrat has mentioned something about it, and Nanny Og says, don't call her the C word or something.
Oh dear.
Because that's who Granny Weatherwax is going to be associated with. But you can see that the stereotype of all of this playing through. If you think of the various goddess figures, even in Greek mythology, Persephone, the dutiful daughter, and Demeter, her mother, and of course they are descended from the other gods. So there's that link of, again, being tied into the cycles of life and death with the seasons. Is it the Hecate or Hecate or various things about the tripartite goddess of witches,
right?
Again, tying into this, and you can see that in Christian, in the Christian religion, God the Father, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus Christ the Son is again that sort of breaking down of everything into this sort of structure to encompass those aspects across a spectrum.
Right. Well, and of course, you could talk about Mary as fulfilling the role of the mother, very much so. And going back to Greek mythology again, Hera, I think, is an interesting example, particularly in relation to Heracles, because there you have the evil mother figure who rejects the infant, literally in this case, because you have the story of Heracles biting too hard. And that's the story, of course, of the Milky Way, because he bit down too hard, and then she tossed him off, and all that milk went splattering all over the place. So
in Hera's defense, she was married to Zeus, who just couldn't keep it in his toga. And there were an awful lot of Zeus's by blows running around, and
Yeah.
Hera, could be a little upset at all of these offspring that have been fathered by her ostensible husband.
There are a few stories along those lines. Yeah. Or
Um,
Norse mythology too. Talking about that tripartite structure. You have the Norns, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, who are kind of very close to the idea of the Greek fates, that sort of thing, with past, present, and future. And that fits very much with Maiden, Mother, Crone as well. So yeah.
and it's amazing how across all of these different cultures, all of these different time periods, this idea of birth, the main part of your life, and death being part of this cycle and being tied to the feminine, to the female, because this is the essential maternal line of creating life.
Yeah.
And so that's what the rule is over. So you can see why Freud was tied into that aspect, because it is so central. You can see why Jung was attached to it as well. And you can see why all of these myths grew up as well. It's a central conceit of all of this.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that Hera gets horrendous press in Greek mythology, whereas Athena, ostensibly a very, very similar character, gets all of the good press. Hera is so often portrayed as arrogant and cold and bitter, and that's sort of the crone figure, whereas Athena is the protective mother who is a warrior, and she is brilliant. And while there are various reasons for it, one of the ones that often gets overlooked is Athens rose in power, and because Athena was the patron of Athens, hence the name, quite a lot of the mythology maybe got tweaked a little.
Oh yeah.
So it flattered Athena. In the Odyssey, Odysseus meets up with Hermes, and Hermes is his grandfather, because Odysseus is meant to be the son of Autolycus, the king of thieves, right. And Autolycus' father was Hermes, the god of thieves. Yeah. And Odysseus and Hermes don't recognize each other. Hermes is not Odysseus' patron, even though Odysseus is a thief, a liar, a cattle rustler, a pirate, and a storyteller. All of the things associated that Hermes would have quite liked. Yeah. No, apparently in the Odyssey, his patron is going to be Athena. And you go, why Athena? She has nothing to do with any of the aspects of who Odysseus is. And you think, well, when the version of the Odyssey that we have has clearly been tampered with multiple times over the centuries, and it looks like the version we have is from Athens' ascendancy, and therefore chunks of it get rewritten to flatter Athena rather than Hermes.
Interesting. Interesting how these things evolve, but there is a very rich mythology. You could also go to the Celtic, regions and talk about the Morrigan, and she has various aspects as well. Yes, she is a war goddess, but you do see her as a young, attractive, but motherless person, and then you do see her as a crone sometimes as well. She is probably somewhat behind the figure of Morgan Le Fay, as she appears in various stories, such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, right? Where Morgan Le Fay appears as an old crone right next to this beautiful young lady of the castle. And some people even think that both are Morgan Le Fay here, and these are just different aspects of her. And of course, Morgan Le Fay plays this role of the challenger to the Arthurian court and its ideals and all that it represents. She's the spoiler. She's the one who's out to show that they're not the almighty patriarchal warriors that they play themselves out to be.
But even if you think of the story of Snow White is the beautiful maiden, and then the evil stepmother as mother. And then the disguise in the Disney version, the disguise is she appears as an old crone. So you have that structure in it to reflect that. This is so malleable and so pervasive that it is a wonderful symbol that gets applied through multiple texts.
Absolutely.
And I think that leads us on to really discussing the Wicked Witch. The Wicked Witch of the West is obviously the perfect example of this, but we can talk about others. So what do you think of that as an example of like the negative variant of the crone?
Well, and it's interesting because in the Wizard of Oz, you do have the wicked evil witch, the wicked witch of the West, but you also have the beautiful nice witch. So you get these, again, these dual aspects. I forget the name of the nice one, but
Glinda?
Glinda, yes, and she's all glowing and nice and beautiful and all that.
And now in Technicolor.
And now in Technicolor, that's right. So you get this dual aspect there as well, and I do think that that's a very influential story, particularly here in the United States, but probably elsewhere as well at this point, in terms of how people conceive of witches at all. I guess she's sort of very prototypical, I guess, in some ways, of what we can think of, what we conceive of these days, at least. I think, is that fair to say?
Because again, in the Wizard of Oz, like Dorothy as the young girl, the maiden, then
Yeah.
Glinda as the supportive mother, and
Yeah.
then the Wicked Witch of the West as the evil crone.
Yeah.
You can see that structure again can be applied. Even, well, obviously Glinda and they refer to each other as sister, but
Yeah.
but you can see that structure of this tripartite division in that story.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah.
And obviously, well, America has a history with witches being framed in a very specific light,
Yes.
which is not necessarily the same in other parts of the world, and is the same in again other parts of the world. Witchcraft is has a very rich and complex history that we are not getting into because, first of all, I'm not a folklorist, nor am I an historian who has worked with any of this. And I think that might be an interesting aspect for people qualified to discuss it to have.
Yeah.
But witches as evil, this wicked witch that we see in The Wizard of Oz,
Yeah.
that gets replicated time and time again, of the old crone staying in an abandoned little or a rundown ramshackle cottage in the middle of a forest surrounded by all of these herbs, and yet the wise woman of the village, the wisdom,
Right.
you would associate maybe with this crone figure. And then in Jordan's The Wheel of Time,
Yeah.
he kind of subverts that, because he has a young attractive woman in the role of wisdom,
Nynaeve.
whereas
Yeah.
and everyone complains about it, thinking no, she should be older. And it's playing into that archetype of the crone, the wisdom accrued through the ages, where she would be in her little cottage knitting, and strange brews going on, surrounded by all of these herbs everywhere. That's the image that's being conjured that Jordan is playing with. And
Right.
the only way he can play with it is if it is already well established.
Yeah. Yeah. No, Nynaeve is an interesting example because she is grumpy, and she's famous for the braid tugging and all that. And she's kind of in the way you would expect an older woman to be a little bit of a scold, that sort of thing. But she's young and attractive. So yeah, it's an interesting wrinkle there, I think, that Jordan presents, for sure.
And of course, it ties into the Arthurian links between what Jordan was doing, because Nynaeve, you could easily see as Nineveh or Nimue, depending on which Arthurian variant you're looking at. So, I mean, that you can see that character in the Arthurian sort of legends.
Yeah.
And it's a nice point of connection, because everyone goes, oh, it's Nynaeve. And you go, yeah. And how close is that to Nineveh?
Pretty close. Yeah. And the other example you already mentioned, which I think is a really good one, maybe we could talk about a little more, because I just recently read Summer Night by Jim Butcher, which is the fourth book in the Dresden Files. Fourth, I think. Yeah, fourth. That's where I am. So there he really does set up these different courts, the summer court and the winter court. So without getting into spoilers, there are three queens of each court. And you have the mother, the really elder one, and they are presented as these kind of old ladies who literally do knit. So what is it with the knitting, right? And you have the
Think
right?
no, but hang on. Think back to the fates. Think back of spinning the
Exactly.
thread of someone's life.
Yeah,
And that's what the knitting is, the creating of a pattern out of the threads.
exactly.
That's why it's such a wonderful symbol to tie into all of this stuff.
Yeah. Oh
And
yeah.
it's so well, you're like sitting in a chair, knitting away, and then the shears come out to snip it off, and that is the end of the life. So the
Yep.
spinning of yarn, the knitting of a pattern, the weaving of a tapestry, you can see how all of these things play into multiple versions and
Yeah.
multiple variants of these female figures.
You could say that knitting is woven into this archetype.
You could say that. I'll just sigh at it.
So, but that I loved Butcher's, version of it there, and then you have the more mother figures, who are sort of the proper queens of their respective courts. Then you have the young up and coming ones who would be the equivalent of the maiden, but he has a definite wrinkle there in terms, which I won't get into because that would be too spoilery. But they are not your typical maidens. Let's just say that. So, but
Sorry, I've just remembered some of those scenes.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway, moving on.
Yes, indeed. So another mythology we didn't touch on yet is the Hindu, where you do see goddesses who often have a benevolent aspect and then can have a very fearsome, like Kali, for example, where a death goddess kind of thing with the tongue hanging out and holding severed heads in some of her arms and that sort of thing. So it seems to be a worldwide thing to have these women, archetypal figures who have these dual aspects of kind and loving versus the fearsome kind. So it's so pervasive, and it is something that we see a great deal in fantasy. Another wicked witch we haven't talked about yet is in Narnia, right? Where you have the white witch,
The White Witch, Jadis.
Jadis, yes, who is a beautiful figure who can be attractive, and a surrogate mother of a sort, but of course is quite evil at the same time.
And without being too crude about it, and unfortunately, this is going to sound kind of crude, but she is cold and bitter and barren because it's associated with ice and snow and not the fertility and warmth and growth associated with, say, the rest of the realm of Narnia and Aslan and that force of life. She's been linked to snow and ice and death and people dying. So she's all the negative aspects.
Yeah.
And so it's you can see why she's being connected more to the crone than to a mother figure.
Right.
Even though, and also she doesn't have her own children, whereas Aslan refers very much to like the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve, and everyone in Narnia is his child, and it's the Christian mythology in the Chronicles of Narnia sometimes can be a little much, but
yeah.
Um,
To give a more modern example of an author who does, I think, some interesting things with mother figures would be Neil Gaiman in, say, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, or in Coraline, or something like that, where he really plays with this, I think, in there, doesn't he?
And in American Gods,
And in American Gods.
Gaiman puts a very modern spin on a lot of the mythological and archetypal discussions, and we see that time and time again. But he again, like, he isn't the only one. Like Terry Pratchett, as we mentioned earlier, with the Three Witches, and of course that's straight out of Macbeth with "When shall we three meet again?" We can see this as all part of a continuation of the same sort of narrative threads, as each author is taking up the symbol and playing with it in a different way. That this, and it is so well understood, and it fits with so many different cultures and backgrounds, that we are very comfortable reading these symbols. And you can see that that's why this is an archetype. This is something that stands out, even despite the individual variants. This is something that we can see symbolically across so many different texts,
and it resonates.
That the Wicked Witch is just, I think, so heavily dominated in modern storytelling by the Disney version and by The Wizard of Oz and Snow White. Those are the two, I think, that have really dominated the Western cultural perception of
Mhm.
what the Wicked Witch is, what the Crone is, what the evil is.
Yeah.
Um, and because of that image, because it is so pervasive, it colors a lot of how these are played with in other texts.
Right. Absolutely. Another great example, Lord of the Rings. When you look at Galadriel as a beneficent mother figure, yes, but it's something that I think Peter Jackson plays up even more in the film, is that moment when Galadriel is kind of tempted by that ring, and you see her literally transform into this monstrous form, on the screen, and that's a pretty terrifying scene there, especially for poor little Frodo.
And
Right?
and interestingly, about that scene as Jackson has it visualized,
Yeah.
the colors all go to those the greens and blues of the ocean, the
Yeah.
cold ocean and ice colors. So
Yeah.
again, tying back into the Chronicles of Narnia, that this is, we can see how it's going with that coldness and barrenness, and
Mm.
that's being contrasted with the fertility of Lothlorien, the golden, almost autumnal, summer autumnal aspect of Lothlorien. And Rivendell, again, is that sort of lush, beautiful, all in the midst of full bloom.
Right.
And the darkness, the evilness is being associated with winter, the end of life, the end of all of these things.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Our pal Steven Erickson has some interesting witches, of course, in the Malazan series, beginning right from the very beginning. You have a wax witch presented in the form of Rigalai, right? And right from the beginning of Gardens of the Moon up until, there are quite a few variants, like Samar Dev, for example, is a witch of a sort, right? I mean, she's called that. She's an interesting wrinkle too, but he always seems to do something a little bit different with his witches, doesn't he?
Yeah, and but even that we see aspects of the Crone being played with, because think of the powerful witch in Malaz City,
Mm.
who
Oh
is
yeah,
Kiska's uh, ostensible aunt,
right.
and has connections to other magic users in the series. And
Yeah,
again, we're doing this without spoilers, so we're not naming any of this stuff, but
yeah.
uh, she is, Agila is very important
Very great
in that
example.
aspect.
Yeah, yeah,
And again, associated with being a weaver, the maker of
yeah.
patterns and
She does the
out of.
weaving. Yeah, and her shop has all the herbs and everything else in it, and so he's definitely hitting those notes, isn't he? Yeah.
So that's why the Wicked Witch being tied into the aspect of the Crone being tied into the aspect of the end of life.
Right.
And again, think back to Persephone and Demeter. Demeter is the washed up, shriveled up woman, because her daughter is now grown up and married, and she is now left behind, and she is autumn and winter,
Mm.
whereas Persephone is spring and summer. Um, so it's, we can see these points of connection throughout all of history tied into this aspect. But with the Wicked Witch,
Mm.
one of the psychological aspects associated with Wicked Witches is jealousy or envy of youth and beauty,
There you go.
which again, psychologically, end of life being jealous
Mm.
and envious of the beginning of life with that whole future they are at the end. So you can see that psychological connection being played out.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. And obviously a something that has resonated over centuries and centuries, because it does speak to the cycles of life, doesn't it? And there are associations in regard to motherhood and fertility or lack thereof, which could be portrayed as the monstrous, right? Somehow or other, the infertility being associated with the negative, and that is unfortunately where the tradition seems to be coming from in many respects. But that is also something that I think modern writers can play with and do have some nice subversions of. And we certainly are seeing a lot of that these days as well. So any other examples you want to talk
Well,
about?
I would say one last sort of set of examples I wanted to talk about was if you think of a lot of the old folk tales, a lot of the old fairy tales,
Hmm.
the young hero quite frequently meets a helpless old woman on the road who has lost her dogs or who has mislaid something, and the hero helps her. And it turns out that she's actually a powerful goddess figure, or she is
Right.
a powerful female magic user of some kind who is in disguise to test the hero's resolve. And then we see the parallel of that in someone like Baba Yaga, who is
Ah,
a creepy evil witch who eats children and lives on a house that has chicken feet that walks around.
yeah.
But in folktales, you also quite often have evil witches trying to dupe the young hero into doing something for them, and the hero outwits them. That again, all of it ties into this the older female figure trying to manipulate the young male hero,
Mm,
and we see it older female figure manipulating young female heroes as well. But I'm
right.
just thinking back to a lot of the earlier folk tales that were
Yeah.
male centric,
Right.
and it again ties back into that Freudian aspect that you discussed at the very beginning
Yeah.
of the tension between the much older woman and the younger man, and that bond that has to be explored in one way or another, be it Oedipus or or something slightly more normal and natural. And let's never talk about Oedipus again.
We're all trying to get back to mommy. That's all it is. So well, on that note, I will ask our viewers to come up with their examples, favorite or otherwise, of the Wicked Witch or various incarnations of these figures that we've been talking about in this video, Maiden, Mother, Crone. We are going to have another discussion that will be on AP's channel, A Critical Dragon. That one will focus on the Maiden and various aspects of the Maiden. So that should be that's a very dualistic one as well. So should be a very interesting discussion. But please do leave your comments. And AP, thank you so much for this discussion. I enjoyed myself thoroughly, as always.
Thank you very much, Philip. This has been a lot of fun, and it's interesting. This is not an aspect of literature that we generally talk about, and this is loads of fun. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's always a pleasure.